All right, so we're going to go ahead and start our next lecture. We're going to be talking about the Cold War and kind of its impacts on a couple of little small events that we haven't talked about so far, but in general, think communism, think Second Red Scare, and think about general Cold War effects with the USSR. So we are on the pig notes, and on the pig notes, we're past Korea, so we're in the section just after that, which is the political change parts in the 1950s and in the 1960s. So we're going to start with political change with Harry S. Truman. So remember, Harry S. Truman's going to be the guy that's going to drop the atomic bomb. That's kind of what we know him for. Now, before the Korean War, after the dropping of the atomic bombs, Truman is going to start something known as the Fair Deal. Now, you can think of the Fair Deal as basically the New Deal. It was his attempt to be able to create all these different reforms in America. Now, he promised us a fair deal. That was the goal. However, the Fair Deal really wasn't effective at all, and neither did they really do much of anything about it. The Fair Deal never really came to pass because when Truman is going to come into the presidency, his presidency is going to be defined by the Korean War, which is kind of going to ruin his second presidency. So Truman's going to come into the second presidency positive, Fair Deal legislation, but in reality it's going to all go away with the Korean War. Now, Truman obviously was really happy to be able to win, but obviously, as we know with Korea, he's going to kind of get inundated with all these things going on with Korea, and as we know, he's going to fire McCarthy, which is going to make him look really bad, according to the American people at least. Now, following Harry S. Truman, though, you're going to have a new president come in, which is Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, he was going to be the general in D-Day, or was the general in D-Day. So, a lot of people liked him. He was a war hero. He was very astute. He was very collected. And Eisenhower is going to come in, and his biggest thing that you would need to know about Eisenhower is going to be known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. So the Eisenhower Doctrine is basically going to say that if another country is possibly going to fail and collapse from communism, that you have the ability to be able to send economic assistance or military forces if they're being threatened by armed aggression. Now, this is going to be in particular with the Middle East. Now, if you don't know about the Middle East, basically in the Middle East, you're right next to Russia. And so the problem that you're going to have is that they're going to feel like Russia is going to collapse the Middle East into communism. And so that's kind of where you get these political cartoons of all this communism issue going on. Now, NATO is going to come into this as well as the UN in order to be able to stop this. But basically, this allows us to be able to send economic and military aid to countries in the Middle East that they felt like would possibly fall if it was going to be impacted by communism. Now, this brings us to what is known as the U2 crisis. Now, the U2 crisis, which, fun fact, I one time had a student who cheated on an assignment and put U2 as the band. That is not what we're talking about here. U2 crisis is actually going to be about a plane known as a U2 plane. Now, a U2 plane looks like this. Basically, it's a spy plane. Right underneath the plane is going to be a really, really big camera. And this big camera is going to take aerial photos of whatever is underneath it. And so the goal of having the U-2 plane is basically to be able to spy on another country. It's kind of like our modern day drones. Well, the problem is that we were trying to spy on Russia, even though we had an agreement with Russia that said we wouldn't do that. So we're flying these U-2 planes over Russia, and unfortunately, it's going to be shot down. Now, this is shot down by a guy named Francis Gary Powers, which you may have heard of him if you have ever seen the movie Bridge of Spies. So the whole movie about Bridge of Spies is all about the impact of this whole U2 crisis event. What happens when we have one of our spy planes shot down? How is Russia going to respond? Now, what happens basically in all of this is that we decide to do a prisoner exchange. We allow Francis Gary Powers to come back to America while we exchange one of their former spies, or alleged spy, back with the USSR. Now, all of this really shows distrust. Russia doesn't really trust us anymore at all because we basically sent in a spy into Russia even though we said we weren't going to. And so kind of what the U2 crisis is, it's another event of us coming and having basically concern and fear of the other country, because what happens is that we're going to have all these spies and things like that, and Russia's going to fear us spying on them. And so it basically shows that we just can't work together or trust each other at all. Now, this is going to bring us into Kennedy. So Kennedy is going to come into the presidency in 60. And so there's two really big events that are going to kind of define Kennedy during this time. And one of them is what's known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. So the Bay of Pigs invasion is going to be all about this guy named Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel Castro is going to be the dictator in Cuba. Now, the fear in America is that if Cuba falls to communism, well, that's just a step away from America. So America could follow communism. And then, of course, we know our whole containment policy and things like that. Well, what happens is that in Cuba, we're kind of going to have this upsurgence of dictatorship and possible communism. Now, what we want to be able to do, though, is we want to stop these communists from rising up in Cuba. And so something known as the Cuban Invasion Brigade is going to go and invade into Cuba and basically attempt anything that they can to be able to stop communism from spreading in America. Or not in America, in Cuba, excuse me. Now, this Cuban Invasion Brigade is going to go in and attempt to overthrow the government. Well, the thing is that this overthrow was, just as we saw in Vietnam and in Korea, going to be secretly funded by the U.S. government. Now, this invasion is going to be what is known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, the Bay of Pigs invasion is basically going to be this location where they're going to attempt to be able to invade and overthrow the government. Now, unfortunately, though, this Bay of Pigs invasion is going to be an absolute failure. We send in all of these American-funded Cubans in order to be able to overthrow their government, and pretty much they fall. Basically, what happens is they expected the people to be able to uprise against their government, but the people end up not doing that at all. And so this brigade ends up getting captured and taken as prisoners of war. And that's kind of when all this thing comes out about America funding this Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, Kennedy is going to massively thank these invaders for what they did. I mean, they were really seen as the go-getters, the saviors of Cuba, of saving Cuba from communism. And what you can see right here is you can actually see this is one of the football championships, the Orange Bowl, I believe it was. And what they're actually going to do is they're going to honor all of these Cubans that uprose against their government in this football game. Now, Kennedy really saw these guys as great guys, but the brigade, they were thankful for Kennedy and the fact that they funded this whole thing. But, it was a failure. That's the thing about the Bay of Pigs. It really was a failure of America. And it made America look really bad. It made Kennedy look really bad, honestly. Now, this whole thing with us not liking Cuba. We've had for the last 60 or so years this pretty clear definition that Cuba is not our friend. We don't like Cuba. So if you've ever seen in a movie a Cuban cigar. So you always talk about the Cuban cigars and how they're illegal and everybody wants them because they're illegal. Well, the reason they're illegal is because it really is a physical representation of the separation between the United States and Cuba. Basically, what's going to happen is that Cuba is going to be cut off from trade from America. And that's why you have the Cuban cigars are going to be so rare, because of the fact that you couldn't trade with America. Therefore, Cuban cigars were illegal up until only a few years ago in America. Now, kind of where some modern day stuff comes into this. I'm sure you've heard of somebody named Beyonce. She's a singer. And Beyonce, as well as her husband, went on a vacation, and they are going to go to Cuba. Jay-Z. Yes, Jay-Z is her husband. So they are going to go on this vacation to Cuba. Now, this causes a whole bunch of concern. How the heck did Beyonce get there? Because tourism is actually illegal. Now, you can actually go to Cuba back then without, you couldn't be a tourist. But what she said basically is that they went and visited schools there for a humanitarian, and they had a visa for it. Now, they actually had to have this whole thing happen in the government to see basically whether or not this whole thing was legal or not. This is back in 2015. Now, additionally, though, you have the impacts not only in there, but also in sports. For the longest time, we did not have any sort of real, other than baseball, we really didn't have a lot of sports go down to Cuba. This changed actually only a couple years ago when they met for a friendly over in Cuba in Havana for the soccer team, and it was only the third time, that America had gone to Cuba in order to play. And it was actually interesting because they had no fans. They went and did this friendly, and because of the U.S.-Cuban relations, they were allowed to go to the soccer stadium and leave, and no fans were allowed because it would be too scandalous with the current political system back in 2015. Now, back in 2014, all this changed a lot back in December. So I was actually on my cruise, and we were traveling past Cuba, and that same exact day, they actually came out and basically said, we are now going to open the doors to Cuba. This was from Obama. And this was huge. Tourism is now going to skyrocket. People are now going to be able to visit their families. It was a really big deal. Now, the very first U.S. cruise ship, it got sold out very quickly because the fact that we were able to be tourists in Cuba was massive. I mean, it was really showing that Cuban-American relations are beginning to ease. Now, Raul Castro is going to be the brother of Fidel Castro. He was actually the very last dictator. Died only about, I don't know, maybe a year ago. And because once he died, we ended up having a lot more easier relationships with Cuba. Now, following all of this, as of about 3 weeks ago, all the Castros have now died. So we're now going into a new Cuba without all of the Castros and things like that. There it is. Now, the Berlin Wall becomes a physical barrier, basically, and a physical obvious barrier of what the Iron Curtain. Now, we've talked about the Berlin Wall in the past. I just want to emphasize again that the Berlin Wall, it comes up actually in Kennedy's presidency in 1961, which is why it's in this part of the PowerPoint. So following the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall is going to be erected, and it really does become the physical barrier of the Iron Curtain between the USSR and America during this time. Now, through all of this, we're going to have brinkmanship, which is John F. Kennedy's foreign policy. Now, the foreign policy that Kennedy is going to do in this brinkmanship is basically saying, think of it as the arms race. If you remember back when we read the Butter Battle book, both of them sit on that wall about to drop the bomb. Well, that's the same exact idea here. Basically, what brinkmanship says is that these two countries are going to be on the verge of war. And basically, we're going to push it so close to war that the other person's going to back down. It's kind of like the idea of the huffing and puffing, basically showing somebody else that you're better than them. And so we live in this kind of constant brinkmanship of who's going to drop the atomic bombs first, which brings us to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a very important term, a starred term. Basically, this is going to be the 13 days where we all thought we were going to die. Now, if you remember with our hydrogen bomb activity, we learned how severe the hydrogen bomb was and why everybody was so scared. And what happens is that in November, of 1962, we discovered that in Cuba, we had several missile sites. Basically, we flew planes over, and what we realized is that all throughout Cuba, all these missiles were ready to go at the push of a button in order to send a bomb to America. Now, why this would be a big deal? Well, all of these bombs could easily destroy America. In fact, they said if you wanted to go from Cuba to Seattle, it would only be about a 12-minute wait. Well, if you think about it, that's 12 minutes from launch time that you have to get in shelter and be saved from a hydrogen bomb. So this becomes a huge and major concern. Now, America is going to combat this by blockading off Cuba. Now, Russia is friends with Cuba. This is the whole communism thing. So basically, this blockade is going to extremely anger the USSR. And the USSR is going to respond by sending military troops and more hydrogen bombs to Cuba. And this begins the Cuban Missile Crisis. Basically, for 13 days, we lived unknowing whether or not we were going to live or die. Everybody woke up thinking this is the day that we're going to die by a hydrogen bomb by Russia. Now, throughout these 13 days, Kennedy is going to work together to find and solve the problem. He makes multiple calls to Russia in order to be able to solve this and calm and ease the tensions between the two countries. Now, at the same time, Americans realized this is really our brink of war. People stopped going to school. People thought a fire alarm would be the bomb coming to wherever it was going to be. And basically, people begin to live their lives under this whole bomb shelter mentality. It really was, when we do duck and cover, it was duck and cover every single day. Now, people begin to live and start to live into these bomb shelters in their backyard, which you can find all throughout the Utah and including at Skyline. And people were preparing these bomb shelters to be able to live for months and months at a time. A lot of people thought they would have to live under there for 6-7 months. And so these bomb shelters kind of became like a second home. Now, eventually after the 13 days, Khrushchev as well as Kennedy make an agreement. And Khrushchev basically backs down. This is a really big shock. I think they didn't want to go to war, but I think that we were really, really close to being bombed and basically killed here in the United States. Regardless, though, the USSR is going to back down. The Cuban Missile Crisis ends as quickly as it began. Only 13 days of this all-out war and fear that we were all going to die by these hydrogen bombs. Let me make sure. All right. And that's pretty much it. So that's a brief overview. Most important things, Cuban Missile Crisis, brinkmanship, the idea that we're going to be closer and closer to war, and just in general, fear of communism.